Hi, welcome to White Women Wake Up.
I'm Jonelle.
And I'm Karen. Together, we're diving into real, unfiltered conversations about what it means to wake up as white women in a world shaped by bias, privilege, and inherited patterns. We're here to challenge norms, unpack our privilege, and foster empathy through raw, intergenerational dialogue. It's not always easy, and we don't always agree, but we show up anyways.
We do. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Jonelle. Hey, I have done my reflection, not my homework, my reflection.
I appreciate you calling it reflection.
I know. Anyways, I've been thinking about one of the things that I took away from our conversation about white Christian nationalists is this language of religion and politics. And I think you've called me this forever, that I am naive. I am really naive to think that we could even make any movement towards separating politics and religion because it's been embedded for thousands of years. Yet, one of the things that I thought you said in the conversation that was really impactful for me was this idea that when we associated a religion to a specific political nation or a nation, we can blame the religion. Yeah. So, for example, in the Mideast, if we're looking at Iraq as more Muslim, we will blame the Muslim faith rather than the political leaders of Iraq.
Yes.
We see it right now with what's happening with the political leaders in Israel and how they're treating the Palestinians, and we're blaming Jewish people.
Yeah.
When in fact, we need to keep focusing on those political leaders. So that's one way I think we can separate church and state.
No, I think
that really actually, if anything, I walked away really strong for that conversation.
Well, and I
Thank
think,
you.
And that's such a great perspective because I think so often in the U.S. we talk about separation of church and state, and so we don't see how integrated we are, but yet it's easy to point fingers outside and easy to say, hey, well, these countries are so integrated and they don't have separation there. But and so it's...
Yeah, you're right, because other countries are probably saying, look at those Christians, what are they doing when they're talking about America?
And there's so many of us who would love to be separated from both our government's ideals and a lot of Christian nationalist views too. Yeah. Even as Christian ourselves, growing up in Christians, do not associate at all with the views of Christian nationalism and stuff.
And you're another thing you did a really good job was defining nationalism. You're right. To be someone who loves their country doesn't mean you have nationalist values.
No.
Nationalism is like an ideology, a single core ideology.
Those are patriotic values. And unfortunately in our country now, nationalism has kind of co-opted patriotic values. And so people have walked away from that. But no, there is core differences there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that definition.
Great.
Yeah. It was a good conversation. If anything, it was really good for me to constantly just reflect on it. I'm learning. I'm learning to unlearn.
No. And the thing is, I have called you naive. I also think, again, this is the point of this podcast and this dialogue is as white women, we are definitely raised to be naive to these concepts. Yeah. Because they don't often affect us in the same way, as we say over and over again, as they do many other communities in our country. And so naivety is kind of
it's comfortable.
It's comfortable. It's what, you were raised exactly how the system wanted you to be raised. So it's not necessarily your fault.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's going to be my topic next.
Oh, but interesting.
Go on.
Oh.
You are on today.
Sneak peek into next week's topic.
Sneak peek. Yeah. Okay. This is your topic.
So my topic is a little timely. So this happened a couple weeks ago once this airs, and it just has brought so many clouds of thought in my head. And so I really want us to unpack this in a conversation that this is something we're both have been guilty of. And anyways, let me get to the bread and butter. So I want to talk today about our country and our culture's embeddedness with like the antebellum South and plantations, and how we romanticize these and we don't separate and see the pain within them, kind of thing. And so a lot of this is coming out of discussions from the Nottaway plantation that recently burned down. Have you not heard about this?
No.
Whoa, look at your face. What?
Oh, gosh. Where have I been?
We are on two different sides of TikTok, lady.
Yeah. Wait, so a plantation in the South?
So the Nottaway, which is the highest generating plantation in the South. So they have about an annual revenue of about $25 million. A little over 25.4 million is what it was estimated last year. And it's a whole retreat, resorts, weddings, whole situation, tour guide. And again, the house is spectacular and beautiful, but they really center the white family that lived there. They barely acknowledge the fact that there was slavery. And even when they do acknowledge it, it's more like, well, these were good owners. And again, what is a good slave owner is still owning a human being, despite there's many historical facts that state that they probably weren't great slave owners. I mean, again. But no, it recently burned down. So there's been all of this dialogue around, of course, a ton of people are like, yes, let it burn. Like the ancestors are finally like uprising. And then there's been a whole host of people who have been very upset by like the loss of this cultural identity, this loss of this historical house, this loss of this. And here's the deal. I obviously still recognize that what we have done to the plantation industry of making them resorts, of making them wedding venues and also denying the history, the horrific history that was there I've known for years how horrific that is. But what really started to interest me in this dialogue or made me start kind of exploring all this is there was a couple comparisons, and I hate comparisons, especially when it's comparing two tragedies, but it was an interesting thought point of why are we okay with having a wedding at a plantation, but would be disgusted by a wedding at a concentration camp?
Oh, gosh, what a great comparison.
And it really...
You know me, I love odd comparisons.
You do love odd comparisons.
I can go there on that one.
I hate comparing tragedies. I hate comparing oppressed people. I hate comparing. But it was such an interesting perspective of like, yes, how are we still so much in the erasure of am I saying that right? Erasure?
Yeah,
I always say that wrong. Erasure.
Because you are erasing the histories of that space.
The horrific histories. And again, I want to hear your initial thoughts because I have so much information more for our listeners around all of this. But yeah, go. This has been like swirling in my head.
Okay. Here's a sneak peek for my conversation. So there's a whole language of medical racism.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we did to our slaves, if we want to compare it to a concentration camp.
I mean, I don't want to compare it.
But if you're going to compare it to a concentration camp.
I'm just talking about why do we romanticize versus.
One of the things, if we do any histories or reading about medical racism, we will see that the U.S. was complicit in doing medical experiments, same as the Nazis, on human beings, on slave human beings. Oh, yeah. And so I don't know if that particular, why can't I think of the plantation?
Yeah.
I don't know if that particular plantation played any role in that. So that might be difficult because maybe they're no different than an area that was close to a concentration camp and yet didn't do it itself. But I'm just saying that because the medical experiments may not have been taking place at that plantation.
Totally. I mean,
but if you want to compare our behavior to Nazis,
no, that's not what I'm asking. No, yeah, I think you're digging into your subject.
I think you're talking about the romanticism of plantation.
I want to understand why
I think your question
as
is
a society
bigger about erasure.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I think if we could step back and talk about studying history, for example, I think we could do both. I think there was things that were happening in the South that I'm sure many people would like to lift up. That maybe it was cultures, attitudes, things like that. Let's talk about the white plantation owners of the South. There may be elements of that particular culture, no different than elements of my Bavarian culture or my English roots. No, just listen to me. That may be worth talking about. It could be beauty, it could be art, it could be architecture, it could be things. And yet, at the same time, these horrific acts happened. Okay, so I agree with you. I think I would encourage anyone who owns a plantation not to erase that, but to talk about it and bring in subjects and conversations around this. Like, so for example, in design history, I've used this example before. I do talk about the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus were primarily run by patriarchal males, and yet they had an influence in design histories. Now, if I stop there, something's wrong with that. I need to open up a broader conversation.
No.
So maybe that's my thing. I don't think I would have a wedding at a plantation.
No.
But I'm not going to judge someone who does. But I do think the erasure.
You're not going to judge someone who does have a wedding at a plantation?
I think.
Wait, what?
Okay. I think your erasure is the conversation that you want to be talking about right now.
Yes and no. I 100% judge people.
Well, you could
have a
Jonelle,
wedding at a plantation.
You could go so deep. We could go so deep and say, you and I live on indigenous property, on Native First Americans' property. So everywhere in the United States, we're having a wedding on land that's not ours.
You're giving in to such this like white American mentality that they want us to give in, is like this tit for tat situation. Like this, how deep do we go? Because that is not the case. We don't have weddings on sacred battlegrounds of Native Americans. Or
okay,
if we do, that's
let me say something. Do you ever fly into Denver?
Step back.
Denver is on a sacred property land of indigenous persons.
I'm not saying that's right. Here's the deal, though. You're breaking this down to extremes.
Go back to your original point then.
You're breaking this down to a point of this is exactly where they want us to get into these states. So again, it dismisses the romanticism of these plantations and what they are doing. So here's the deal. I agree with your initial point on, like, it is about stepping back and also, like, identifying and honoring the people. So, like, you talk about the architecture. The people that we should really be honoring on the architecture are the Black artists who built that.
Yes.
So I think I get that's where you're saying there.
I think it's yes and. I think that this is our stories. Our stories, all of our histories have black and white. They're not black and white, but they're good and bad, right? All of our stories have these places. I am not saying...
Not all of our stories do. This is what I'm trying to say. And this is oh my gosh, wow. People want heated stuff. Like, this is where I'm going to get really into it. This is exactly what I'm trying to say is you are generalizing it to my backyard versus my backyard. It might have been owned historically by Native land. I don't know that for a fact, but you're right.
It was.
Understanding.
Not owned. They didn't own property.
They don't own property. Here's the deal. Fine. But we know for a fact there wasn't generations and generations of intentional slaughtering and slavery in my backyard.
How do you not know that? How do you not know that there wasn't a war there?
But
okay, I don't want to. Okay, let's go back.
No.
Okay,
no, because we don't. Historically, there's not a war in my backyard.
So what
we know, there was hundreds of years of enslaved people.
I agree.
On these actual properties. These people were actually owned by the people that we are celebrating, by the property that we are celebrating.
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I don't disagree.
Again,
so in other words, what Okay, restate.
So look back at the comparison of like, why would we have a wedding at Auschwitz? You wouldn't have a wedding at Auschwitz. This is my point.
Okay.
But like you said, you could have a wedding maybe outside of Auschwitz. I don't know. That's not the point. But like, you're not going to take these historically awful sites and romanticize them in the same ways. Why do we do it around slavery? That's what I'm trying to say. Why do we do it around slavery?
Well, unfortunately, they're not romantic. They're erasing slavery.
No, they're romanticized. But
they're romanticizing slavery? They're romanticizing...
some of them are. They're romanticizing the life. Exactly what you're doing there.
Of these people.
We can't erase the white people's culture, but that's what it's doing. It is uplifting these white people who literally own slaves. They're not people to be uplifted.
Okay, I agree that they're... Oh, I see. You're saying that those particular people are not to be uplifted.
I'm not saying...
This is really complicated because this is what is complicated. Okay, so I just saw this politician from Colorado give a speech about how our wealthy Aspen is, all these wealthy owners that have homes in Aspen are having their homes on the back of day laborers. Okay. And that these day laborers, now you're right, they're not owned by these people, but they're not making enough money.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to me, that seems just as bad as I know it's not as bad, but it's just bad.
Just as bad? Just as bad. No. Okay, this is, again, the whole point of why as a country we romanticize this. Because you are comparing it to day laborers, which is still a bit...
Okay, so
to be raped, to be separated from your family, to be
horrible.
Beaten, to be killed, to be owned is not as bad.
Okay, so
and this is why I don't want to compare oppressions. Okay. But you can't compare slavery.
You're right. I'm supposed to be... So let's step back into the room. Let's step back into the room. One of the reasons Jonelle and I are doing this live is so that we can demonstrate
this is not
or show... No. Well, let's start over again.
Right.
We're showing that we can be in these complex conversations. And one of the things that we have learned, I want to go on about what we've learned, is that these nuanced conversations need conversation.
Yeah.
They need time.
They do.
Because if you think we can get it, think we can get into these conversations in 2 minutes, it's not going to happen.
No.
So Jonelle and I right now, and we're not going to convince either one of us one way or another.
No.
State your point and I'll state my point. So state your point.
This is not where I thought this was going to go. So and it wasn't a point, it's more of an interesting observation, but you're also falling into the interesting observation, and I didn't expect that. But it's the question of, why do we romanticize a lot of this horrific past in history when we don't romanticize other historical tragedies to this sense. And it's not just us. Slavery across the world is romanticized. There are sugarcane plantations, in the Caribbean that are romanticized. There are stuff in Britain. Like, I was even looking at, they talk about castles. Castles were built by impoverished people. And so we celebrate all those things. And so it was just a fascinating thing of, why do we romanticize it? And
I think if I hear what you're saying is, why do we do romanticize wealth?
Yeah.
We romanticize beauty. We're all, I'm guilty of it. I'm not going to say we're all, but I am totally guilty of it. So then you said, and this is the part that I think got you going. So I guess we're going to try to model conversation here because typically I might walk out of a room right now or something, but we're not. You made a comment like, how can someone have a wedding at a plantation?
Yeah.
And then I started comparing it, and it's funny. I wasn't going to bring up castle, but you brought up castle because we almost went to a wedding at a castle and in Ireland.
Yeah.
And does it have the same background as a plantation? Anyways, I think the bigger issue, so let's go to the bigger issue. To me, the bigger issue that you're bringing up, I don't want to say yes, no, because everything is so circumstantial, but I think your bigger issue is erasure.
Totally.
Because when I hear you, what I hear is someone's going to go to this plantation, they're going to go and have their wedding vows and a beautiful ceremony with this nature around them without any clear understanding that this place had really horrific acts of violence in that place. And most likely, almost probably 99%, at least one slave over the histories of those periods was abused. I would imagine many more, but we know most likely, given the history of slavery in plantations, someone had been abused, right? Right.
Yeah.
And they were there without the difference
their
between,
consent.
They were there without their consent. And I agree with you. Why that? So maybe what I hear you saying is, why haven't we learned and this goes back to shame, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're so shameful to hear about our nation's histories that we can't even confront it. We can't even walk alongside it. Like what if that particular plantation, anytime someone had a wedding there, all those monies generated reparations to a family, to the slave people? What if there's a way to not, I mean, if you're going to do it, is there a way to do it where it doesn't erase the past?
Yeah, but it's not in weddings or resorts or celebration.
Yeah.
It's an honoring. I think this is what I'm trying to say is there is no way in my mind that a wedding at a plantation can look as a positive honoring of any sort.
Yeah.
Because it is a celebration, is a romanticized of that lifestyle. Staying there is a romanticized of that white cultural lifestyle, of the master lifestyle. And it erases, even if you have some understanding historical impact of this, you are still celebrating not the slaves, you are celebrating the white-centered culture around that.
And that promoted slavery.
And that promotes it. And so here's the deal. I don't think we have to erase plantations from our history. I think there's ways, as you know, the Whitney Plantation, to do it in historical education.
Yeah.
To build it up in a place that doesn't generate $25 million for capitalism on leisure and, romanticizing. But instead builds profit for, like you said, reparations. It builds profit for education. It builds profit for other things. So that's what I think that's what you're trying to get at, is like, we can still honor the beauty of these things. Like the Whitney Plantation has beautiful grounds. They've kept so many things, and so you can honor that craftsman and the craftsmen of the slaves. You can honor the stories of these slaves, but the romanticizing of weddings, the romanticizing of parties, the romanticizing of, again, a leisure weekend is, I think, incredibly inappropriate. And I just don't know how we are holding on to that. And like you said, we're holding on to it for shame, for guilt. And it's not about guilt. The goal is awareness, not guilt.
So one of the things that you're actually bringing up, and it is political, I'm sorry, but as our current government is letting go of federal funding. So for those people that believe, okay, we're going to look at it this way. For those people that believe that the federal government should not be paying for everything. So one of the things I hear from you is this idea that, yes, leave it as a museum, leave it as a place that tells these stories. Even if it's the full story. Tell the story.
Tell the full story.
Tell the story. So one of the things, though, if the federal government is not going to do that, if we're not going to have federal museums and things like that, then individual persons, like, I don't know if the Whitney family is paying to keep that plantation alive, but individual families actually really need to steward that caretaking. And so what that means is we need to start fostering with our wealthy patrons, if they want to really do their work, like of reparations or of repairing our histories that we have in America, these private spaces, instead of using them like places of celebration, what you're talking about, can they be used as places of stories and histories? And those profits then go back to people that have been hurt by slavery.
And here's the deal, and this is controversial to like very super progressive, on my opinion. At this point, I don't even feel like you have to be a nonprofit. Like, fine, make your profit, but tell the full story. But don't make your profit off of leisure, off of romanticizing. Make your profit still as a tour, as a museum, but a full story. And so an interesting example is Oak Alley, which is actually the plantation you and I visited one time in New Orleans.
I know, and I remember what they, at that time, but that was a long time ago.
They were very romanticizing of it. And we also were too. It's beautiful. Oh my gosh.
Beautiful.
Amazing. I could totally see a wedding here. Like, again, caught up into it. I understand, versus, again, hating the comparisons, versus Auschwitz is obviously horrifically awful, even looking place. So it's not even something you could romanticize.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's part of this discussion as well, is we've made these places so beautiful that we want to be there. Whereas if someone decorated some of these horrific spaces, then we'd go. Yeah. You're right. So we get enthralled with beauty.
Well, and this is actually something I was going to bring up when I assumed our opinions were going to be similar.
It's not that they're differing.
No,
it's just we're trying to unpack all of it.
And it's a great, again, lesson for our audience who probably oftentimes we've gotten some critique of like, you guys are too bubbly. Like you talk, you agree with each other. We don't always agree. This is a great example of, and how I was triggered. Obviously, I got a little like you were triggered. Fine. But one of the things I was going to bring up. Sorry, I'll get back to Oak Alley in a second. But one of the things I was going to bring up around the reason why we start to romanticize this is, or like historically, they've kind of looked at the differences of slavery versus within Auschwitz, which was a modern, much more modern event. Slavery, what happened after slavery ended to bring money back to the South, they did start romanticizing. And this is why you get Gone with the Wind. This is why they built up propaganda. They built up propaganda for people to start remembering the historical culture of the South in a positive manner.
Oh, so that's really how we got in to this space. And then, of course,
which makes totally sense.
Hollywood gets involved.
Yeah, and is like, so, And so it's the propaganda that we've all seen Gone with the Wind. We've all seen the token slaves in those old movies and how they're like, oh, Mr. Happy. They even said that even did historically, like a lot of the house slaves and the nanny slaves you see tend to be this like old mammy who's like a little heavier, a little, just like agreeable, when actually they would say historically you would actually have probably a very thin, beautiful, attractive women in the house. And that's often what led to a lot of these like rapes and mixed families is because they would want the most attractive slave in the house with them. But again, Hollywood kind of switched the narrative of, no, it was a loving mother who couldn't be out in the fields anymore. So that's part of the romanticizing.
Can I, from the history perspective? Yeah. So that period of time was called the Reconstruction era. And when I was in college or high school, we didn't learn anything about the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era is actually really significant because there were promises made to many Black communities. 40 acres and a mule and so forth. Yes. And many of those we started seeing Black persons being in government, and many of those opportunities were taken back from our government when they felt when white people thought they were losing their power again. So that would make sense okay, so we're talking about history, we're talking about gaps, we're talking about our own context, but why did it get romanticized? And now Now, yeah.
We allowed us to internally romanticize it because we didn't have the external lens on us.
Yeah.
Whereas like something like in Auschwitz, they had the external lens on them that Germany could never even hide it, even if they wanted to, because they had the external lens of like, we are not letting you forget this. But no one was watching us. So we built up a narrative.
Yeah.
But back to Oak Alley, which I think is really interesting about these now plantations who are still doing this for profit, who are still kind of romanticizing it, but getting criticism. So Oak Alley rebuilt slave cabins. So when we were there, they didn't have slave cabins. They rebuilt slave cabins.
They had one.
They had one.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But when I couldn't remember, but they said in 2013, which I know we went earlier than 2013, I think. Yeah, we went earlier in 2013. So, but in 2013, they rebuilt slave cabins. But what's interesting that they've done is it is a separate tour. And I think you even have to pay separately. So most people actually choose not to go on it because they don't want to see that. And so I think these are even some of the same parts of like, well, that's not going to help anything.
Okay, ladies, if we're out here to learn how to unlearn, and if you go to Oak Alley, go to the slave tour because we need to be learning.
Or don't go to Oak Alley at all. Go to the Whitney Plantation, which is literally down the street from Oak Alley, and that will give you the solid perspective.
Yeah.
And you can still see beautiful architecture.
You can do both. You can do both.
Well, and this is the point that I was trying to make before I got is like you can still honor the beauty and the architecture but honoring the horrific past and the slaves that built that architecture and give them the historical context and not the erasure, not whitewash it, but it's
good conversation.
Yeah.
Jonelle.
Oh, wow.
This is
we're both going to need to step away for a second.
We are unlearning. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you for joining us at White Women Wake Up. We hope today's conversation sparks something in you, whether it's reflection, a new question. Oh, wow. We didn't even think about what our reflection will be. That's okay.
I don't know. My reflection more is around... It's interesting. We've gotten
I have a good at one.
I was just kind of, geez Louise, the tension is high today. Karen and I just got back from a vacation together, so maybe we've just spent too much time together. No, we love each other. I think my reflection more is going to be is you and I have really meshed on a lot of these topics, both on the podcast and outside the podcast, much more than we ever have in the past. Like we're in this groove. And so my reflection is just still a good reminder of like, what your body does when it gets triggered and how to kind of step back from that to have still good dialogue with interesting points. Like you had some interesting points. I see what you're saying. And so that's still my reflection is no matter how much you keep learning, no matter how much we keep practicing, there's still going to be moments of growth.
Thank you. I was going to say my reflection would be this idea of when do we step into erasure? When do we not look at a full story?
Yeah. Reflect on
how we because I think part of it's the tension of holding both stories.
Yeah.
We don't want to have a life that is awful and burdened and heavy, but we also don't want a life that, like me, is naive.
Yeah.
And I want to hold both stories.
Well, and this is the whole...
And by erasing people, I don't do that.
And this is the point when we talk about like the Confederate statues being taken down is people... We're not trying to erase that history too, but we don't want to celebrate it.
Yeah.
Like that is not, those aren't people to celebrate and stuff. And so it's, how do you said?
Yeah, lift up both stories. Yeah. Thank you,
lift up
Jonelle.
is a different, I wouldn't say lift up both stories.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think for me, when you talk about the plantation, it's the beauty. I can lift up the beauty, the architecture, that part of that story. And then I can lift up the story of listening to the story of people that were enslaved. And what does that mean? And what does it relate to their lives? And how is that affected?
We can hold beauty, but there's hard truths behind beauty.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. That is profound, Missy.
You know, sometimes.
I love it. Okay, so let's start over. Thanks for joining us on White Women Wake Up. We hope today's conversation sparks something in you, whether it's reflection, a new question, a deeper commitment to showing up with empathy and accountability. If you found this episode meaningful, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can also connect with us on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, or whitewomenwakeup.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going.
Oh, and Substack now. We are now on Substack. Apparently, we're just taking over. We're lucky at White Women Wake Up seems to be open on every platform.
No
all
of us white women don't want to say white women. Okay, until next time, stay curious, stay open, and let's keep waking up together.
Bye.
So wait, how are we on GarageBand?
Oh yeah, sorry. Hello. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
great.
It is funny when you get closer to that mic how it makes a difference. And I have a feeling as we talk, I probably do talk more like that.
Somehow we're spot on without me having to turn these knobs.
It's a miracle today.
It is a miracle today.
Okay.
For all our other tech issues, it's a miracle.
Okay, so you're going to